Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Ron Klatz with the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine, our sponsor. Uh, Immortality Now has been brought to you for many years, and we're bringing some of the most influential people in the healthcare profession right to your screen to talk to you about what's new and breakthrough and exciting in the world of anti-aging medicine, longevity medicine, preventive medicine, functional medicine, etc. And we're very happy to have today Dr. Thomas Lewis from MIT. And Dr. Lewis, tell us about your background.
Right, Ron. Dr. Klatz, I've known you for a long time. Really respect what you've done in terms of promoting functional integrative medicine. So kudos to you. So I graduated from MIT with a degree, a PhD in chemistry. Then I went to the Harvard School of Public Health and got cert in toxicology and nutrition in the public interest. And then I met a very interesting ophthalmologist at Harvard who really showed me the path to health, because in the eye, you can actually see disease real time, neurological and vascular disease. And he pointed me on the right path. And most of what I've done since then is use my background to really discern what Dr. Tremp and Dr. McCulley, the pioneer of the homocysteine theory, were doing at Harvard to create a program for longevity, which is my company's called Health Revival Partners. Health Revival Partners, so healthrevivalpartners.com. And we do corporate wellness. We do direct to consumer functional consults, but our mainstay is measuring general risks and physiological risks from the blood with extreme precision and accuracy, because most diseases are smoldering chronic, not raging fires. And the nuance of that is very important in understanding longevity. And
you have some new books out. Actually, you have quite a few books, but tell us about your latest books.
So, I wrote a textbook on Alzheimer's called The End of Alzheimer's. Same title as Bredesen. Ours published first, but it's more of a textbook in academic press. Quarterback Your Own Health, uncovering chronic inflammation, hidden infections. I just published a new book called Cancer is an Infectious Disease. It's not only an infectious disease, but that has to be considered. And then I'm just finishing a very large manuscript called Health Freedom Lost. It was stimulated by COVID, but what the thesis is 100 to 1,000 years of misinformation in health that's made our population unhealthy, which turned a minor virus into a pandemic, and all the ramifications of that.
We also have Carol Peterson, who's rather internationally famous compounding pharmacist, as our co-host. Hello, Carol.
Hello. It's my pleasure to be here. And I heard Dr. Lewis on Mercola, and I said, we've got to talk to him about the work he's doing. It's exactly what we're interested in both ways, both looking at what kind of markers you're using for aging and looking at markers for COVID. You have a COVID panel. We'd love to hear more about each of these and how you use this for self-assessment and how you use it to go forward with patients and help them.
Right. Be very, very glad to touch on that. So, I call what I do precision and accurate measurement of labs from a chronic perspective, not a flaming acute perspective. So my normal limits are based on early mortality risk for every single biomarker. In the standard of care, reference ranges or reference intervals are based on populations.
Mm-hmm.
And as the population gets sicker and sicker, the reference range reflects that. So like if you get a lab today and you're considered healthy, 50 years ago, you might have been considered unwell based on that exact same marker. So reference ranges are not science-based, and they're not even standardized. Our ranges are based on well-published multiple studies for a given marker, C-reactive protein, white blood cells, fibrinogen, uric acid, you name it, that shows where the first indication of early mortality is indicated in good studies using reference intervals, p-values, a real sophisticated algorithm. But at the end of the day, it's very simple. Functional doctors understand that there are normal, reference ranges and then functional normal ranges. And I've just put more science behind that. And I think the reason why this is important, if you look at the standard of care in a traditional doctor, they will say, interesting, like Hyman's paper out of Cleveland Clinic, interesting, but anecdotal and not science-based. I would argue that what we actually do is far more science-based than the standard of care. We just haven't sort of commoditized it yet and made it more well known and available. But how my ranges are so much tighter than the standard of care, and 90% of disease is chronic, and that's the CDC. That's not me. So, that's how we measure things. But I call it evidence-based medicine with a purpose. And since I was trained by two brilliant mechanistic doctors at Harvard, everything I do is tied to mechanisms of disease. So in the standard of care, there are 77,000 plus diagnostic codes. It's a crazy number. Can't count that high. In reality, in my opinion, 90% of these conditions are driven by 5 mechanisms. And I'll quickly run them down. It's poor micronutrient status from poor diets, behaviors, or poor absorption, digestion, absorption. You are what you absorb, not what you eat. And it's the micronutrients. These are the carpenters of your body that do all the repair and recovery. So it's all tied to, are you absorbing, taking in and absorbing micronutrients at an adequate density? The next is what I call thrive versus survive, or you could call it fight or flight. But when we are stressed, and we're putting, stress is good, but too much stress, we're allocating resources over here and we're vulnerable over here. So that's a very underappreciated but important mechanism. The third is stealth chronic infections and toxicity, but mainly infections. And the number one source in aging for infection is not like Lyme disease or staph or the flu. These things don't matter. They come and go, but Lyme disease, but periodontal pathogens. And periodontal pathogens like Treponema denticola is a spirochete. Lyme, Borrelia burgdorferi, is a spirochete. So I would argue that Lyme symptoms in aging is more often caused by oral pathogens from cavitations, root canals, poor oral care, things of that nature. The next mechanism is
Are you recommending, therefore, mouthwash, with brushing 3 times a day, or?
That's a great question. I have a 76-year-old gentleman that just presented objective evidence to us. He's been my client for 2 years. That when you age, it's called long in the tooth, which really means short in the gums. This gentleman has seen about a 75% diminution in recession. In other words, his gums have recovered at the age of 76. And what he is doing, flossing, hydroflossing, water picking twice a week with some povidone iodine, not every day, because the biofilms don't reform instantly. It takes a few days for the biofilm, the pathogenic biofilm, housing project to reform. So you don't want to mess with your microbiome in your mouth. That's why I won't do sort of a Listerine or anything like that on a daily basis. You need that. And, the hydroflossing, and then I will use salt on a toothbrush, preferably a Sonicare, to brush, and it highly stimulates the gums. See, what happens is the earliest formation of gingivitis, here's the tooth and here's the gum, you start seeing a little separation. So if you can use a pressure washer, if you will, and get the antiseptic like iodine down there, and I don't recommend peroxide. All the nurses I work with say peroxide slows healing. So peroxide's a one-time treatment when you have like a scrape, a boo-boo, you do something like that. But when you're doing continuous oral care, like I said, the povidone 10% solution, a little bit of that in your water flosser. And the other thing that my good man Robert used is this called deoxyrinse, which is a weak version of a chlorine dioxide solution, and you swish that around. I have a whole protocol on that, and he does that quite regularly. And literally, his gums, the recession reversed. And if recession reverses, it only means one thing. You are managing the bacteria that was inhibiting the rebuilding of new tissue. So great question though, Ron.
Did this accompany changes in his biomarkers of infection though? I mean, it's one thing to have beautiful gums and beautiful teeth. It's another thing to have a beautiful immune system that's going to take you that extra 10, 20 years of extended lifespan.
Exactly, Ron. And so this is, in pollution control, we call it source reduction, so, if you're exposed to a toxin in the environment, it's intermittent, right? But infections grow. And I recommend everybody read, I better pull it back here, Paul Ewald's book, Plague Time, written in 2000. It explains pretty much everything. So when someone works with me or Dr. Carter or any number of the functional doctors that I have on my team, that we will always do an oral DNA test or another, genomic test for oral pathogens. We'll recommend they get a 3D scan to look for cavitations and deal with that through I have a functional periodontist on my team. But then we use the white blood cells to tell whether it's happening. It's gone systemic. I mean, a red blood cell goes through your heart every minute, so there's a good chance it goes systemic. But we do have immunity out there, so it doesn't necessarily mean it takes hold like a hobo, So might go from place to place. So, in my opinion, so let me just give you my thought on that, Ron. So here's the standard of care. White blood cell counts are normal. Here's my normal based on early mortality. But then in the middle of my normal is an optimal. And I want everybody to have a white blood cell count of 4,400. Count is relative, cells per unit volume. And a neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, which is the absolute, you get neutrophils as percent and absolute, the absolute neutrophils divided by the absolute lymphocytes. And a perfectly healthy, sort of a quiescent innate immune response or a system will have a white blood cell count of 4,400 and a neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio of approximately 1.3. If I look at mortality, you want to be between 4,000 and 5,700 with a neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio of 1.1 to 1.5. But a perfectly healthy individual, which is attainable, and that's how you live to 120, is your neutrophil to lymphocyte 1.3 and your white blood cell 4,400, period.
Thank you for admitting that. It's so good to hear. It's so good to hear other people echoing the discussions at the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine. And we really firmly believe that life expectancies of 120 are in fact possible.
Right. It's real. And Ron, I'm going to make an audacious claim because it's you. We know each other. We've had lunch and dinner together and, interacted in various ways. And I'm driving home from visiting my daughter in Massachusetts on Sunday, 13-hour drive. And I'm listening to lectures and I'm listening to Mercola talk to Morley Robbins about iron and ferritin. And I think that's an extremely important anti-aging measurement. And I've developed the ferritin to free iron ratio. And it's simple, but a lot of people aren't doing it. And you want that to be around 0.6. Ferritin to iron ratio. Okay. But Robbins talked about the accumulation of iron in the liver and other tissues. And I think fundamentally that could be a component of our biological clock, the accumulation of this, because iron is a fundamental atom. There's nothing more fundamental than atoms and their subcomponents. It's
strongest pro-oxidant, isn't it?
It's a pro-oxidant.
Yes.
It's paramagnetic. So it has some very interesting properties. And what I think is happening with iron is when it accumulates in soft tissue, it is a catalyst for growth of organisms. So it's called anemia of chronic inflammation, or I really call it anemia of chronic infection. And I'll refer to my mentor, Dr. Tremp, who said, look, the richest fishing grounds in the world are the Georges Banks. Why? because the Iron Range of Minnesota and Sorel, Canada has iron mining areas flow out from the St. Lawrence into the upper Atlantic. And that iron catalyzes microbial growth. So you have the whole life spectrum up there. But we know, like when I had COVID in December, you know, your iron should be around 100. I'll just pick numbers. Your iron should be around 100 and your ferritin should be around 100. My iron went to 14. I had a temperature of 103. I went and got labs the day my temperature was the worst because I was curious. And my ferritin was like 2,000.
Yeah.
Why? Because my body was trying to save my life by reducing the ability of the infection to replicate. It needs iron for that. So it put my iron as low as it could to keep me alive, and threw all the rest into ferritin that becomes unavailable for the infection. So I think when you have iron accumulating in tissue, it completely congruent with Charles Mayo, the founder of the Mayo Clinic, that talked about oral pathogens and either coined or promoted or, you know, popularized the term of a focal or a localized infection. And I'm very familiar with localized or focal infection. You know, an oral thing is an oral, you know, an oral problem is a focal infection. Alzheimer's, Judith McCloskey out of Switzerland. Alzheimer's is spiroketosis, published in 1993. So you have a local infection in the brain. That's the difference between Parkinson's, ALS, and Alzheimer's. It's where that local infection is. Arthritis is a local infection, most likely periodontal, in the joint, because periodontal disease infections are bone eating. That's why a two-dimensional X-ray shows bone loss. Okay, so now I'm beginning to understand why potentially that these local or focal infections can occur in specific tissue due to the way iron might accumulate in this tissue. And there's a professor, I don't know where, but was in that conversation, that can measure your sort of tissue-based iron with MRI technology. You know, anything that's a little bit, that has a different spin. You know, it's not just carbon and hydrogen. You can see that in a different type of MRI. So that's out there. But
you had mentioned that there's 77,000 diagnostic codes. These are ICD-10 numbers.
ICD-10 codes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay. How do you figure out anything? How can you possibly coordinate and collaborate the different symptoms and the different laboratory and the different response to therapeutics with 77,000 different diagnostic codes? It's mind-boggling.
That's why they want the more codes, the better, because you have more individual new drugs. You know, it's like, what about these old drugs? And, you know, we can repurpose the drug. No, we're going to add more codes, because I think they're only like 20,000 plus or minus a few thousand with ICD-9. So now they have an opportunity for another 50,000 drugs.
Right.
It's pretty amazing the way the system has changed since the 1960s, 1970s, when I think we were at the peak of diagnostic healthcare in the U.S.
Yeah, and so my last mechanism, my fourth mechanism, was stealth infections, is number 3, perpetual low-grade inflammation. The brain is rather unique in that if someone gets a concussion, they may be they may have their brain in an inflamed and dysfunctional state for years. Let's say I'm a hockey player. I bang my head and bang my elbow with the same force. My elbow may be better in 2 weeks. My brain may not be better in 2 years. So there's something about microglial activation in the brain. So if you're going to treat Alzheimer's or other types of neurological conditions, that may be an infectious process. It may be stimulated by the insult that sort of creates a deficit in that tissue. But you better have a very good program to down-regulate inflammation. And then my last mechanism is lack of autophagy or autophagy, however we want to pronounce it, due to a sedentary lifestyle and or constant eating. Never giving you never giving yourself a break, because, intermittent fasting is a great way to get rid of senescent cells. Another thing is, so the iron serves two masters, and anybody who's interested in longevity needs to donate blood. But you need to test your iron, ferritin, and your other iron parameters, transferrin, UIBC, things like that. But you want to give blood because it's been shown that when you hook an old mouse up to a young mouse, blood-wise, they kind of harmonize in the middle. The older mice gets younger and the younger mice gets a little bit older. But what they find is if you just give blood, not only are you getting rid of iron, but you're getting rid of sluggish senescent cells. And my colleague who told me about this said it's like an old department chair. It's like they've passed that usefulness and all they're doing is getting in the way. And that's what senescent cells are like too. So giving blood, and Mercola now is giving, because he gets a phlebotomist comes, he's giving 2 ounces of blood every week or something like that. And he's calculating that based on that, he's actually getting ahead of the curve of removing iron from his soft tissue where it shouldn't be. So that's why.
That's all very interesting. Now, with your lab and you're following how many people's blood parameters right now?
The question is how many different types of blood parameters?
Yes.
No. How many people, how many clients are you following their blood on a regular basis to achieve optimal?
Right now I have right around 2,000 people that are running the labs either every 3 to 6 months.
That's great. What are your findings with regard to COVID? With regard to the spike proteins specifically?
So what I'm finding is it's not this overt change. Absolutely seeing an elevation in D-dimer.
Yep.
Absolutely seeing a depression in the absolute lymphocytes. And the other thing I'm seeing is a slight, maybe a 25% increase in monocytes. And monocytes, turn into macrophages. And macrophages, we're all old enough to remember this, is the Pac-Man of your white blood cells. They really can glom on to larger aberrant things in your body. And so that's what I'm seeing. And even a year ago, there were studies that showed that macrophages had spike protein in it for, many months. Now, white blood cells, I'm not sure how long they hang around. The red blood cells hang around for 4 months. So that's what I'm seeing. But the other piece that I'm seeing is that individuals that are long hauling see traditional markers elevated. And what I believe is it's not the spike protein related. I think the D-dimer, the little razor blades cutting into your glycocalyx, the monocytes and the lymphocytes. But I'm seeing white blood cells up. I'm seeing fibrinogen, which is a signal molecule for inflammation. I'm seeing C-reactive protein up. I'm not seeing homocysteine up per se. But what I think is happening is that this is another bandwidth thing. It's occupying bandwidth. And a lot of people that have underlying conditions that they weren't even aware of are coming out to play. The other thing I'm seeing elevated, because I do chlamydial antibody titer on everyone, which looks at chlamydia trachomatis, which is very uncommon, actually, the STD, but chlamydia pneumoniae. And I'm always doing a blood-based H. pylori, Nobel Prize in Medicine 2005. You can look at it in the stool, you can do a breath test, but the more accurate way to look at H. pylori is in the blood because it creates ulcers. It's living in the lining. It's living off the blood, not in the poop. And the standard of care level for this, for H. pylori is this, but what I'm seeing is even at low levels, I'm seeing a disruption in gut integrity, but it jumped up substantially. And I do understand that the spike has effect on the gut as one of the sort of the, if you don't have good acid, You're not killing these viruses when you swallow 1.5 liters of saliva a day. So it's a great net system to capture toxins. And then if you have strong hydrochloric acid in your gut, you destroy them. But I think a lot of people don't. And H. pylori has been benefiting from this with the spike, with the both the jab and the virus itself, but mainly the jab. I'm seeing more people have elevation in their labs who got the jab, which in my cohort isn't a huge percentage of the people I see. Most of the people who come to me through different webinars I've been on, docuseries, are more educated. So I'd say only about 10-15% have got some level of jab. But I'm getting
the opinion that are you of the opinion that COVID is a bioweapon?
Oh yeah. You know, I have a chart, Ron, based on Dr. Ewald's work, and it's very simple. On this axis is transmissibility, and on this axis, so the x-axis, is virulence, how deadly it is. Ebola 10 years ago killed 7 Americans, 7, yet it's extremely deadly. Why? Because the number one way to protect yourself from pathogens is through hygiene. When I read that in Paul Ewald's book, I said, nah, that's not right. But it's completely right. If you look at the tuberculosis curve in terms of number of tuberculosis deaths per population, when antibiotics were introduced and then the vaccine was introduced for tuberculosis, they weren't even blips on the thing. You couldn't even see it. It was a recognition of transmission. Okay. So Ebola, it's very clear, and there's no latency period. So it's very easy to control. Chronic diseases that I think are infectious based on periodontal, chlamydial, chlamydia pneumonia, things like that. You don't know you're transmitting them, but they're also not very virulent. So they don't catch up to you for 30, 40, 50, 80, maybe never. But in the middle there is this zone of latency, transmissibility, and lethality. And if you look at where the flu is, the common cold, Ebola, some of these other things, and you put it on that curve, you find out that this SARS-CoV-2 virus is perfectly placed for a pandemic. Enough latency to avoid hygiene, like Ebola, to be spread widely and to be delayed in symptoms. That's what the latency is all about. But just enough virulence to go beyond the flu, maybe a little teeny bit, and a lot. And because it's a novel thing, and we're not going to use repurposed drugs to say the only alternative is we have to declare an emergency to develop a vaccine. So irrespective
the vaccine has not delivered on the promise of preventing the disease, has it?
No.
Like the opposite.
That wasn't the objective. It was just to get the jab. It's just to get the jab in, and whatever the future purpose is, God help us. But there's an interest. I don't watch TV, but someone got me this TV series on CD. It's called The Person of Interest, and it went from 2011 to 2015. And in 2015, there was an outbreak, and it's in New York City, everybody's lined up to get their shot. 2015. Why? Because they want your DNA, or it's all about an AI. And so it's chilling. Chilling the relationship between that particular episode and their 5th season and what's going on here. So, Ron, I don't worry about, I should be calling you Dr. Klatz out of due respect.
No, that's okay, Ron.
But when you look at the venom theory and the snail venom and all that stuff, that may well be. But my point is, on that curve of transmissibility versus lethality, is there a coincidence that it's perfectly designed on that curve?
So with your program, are you able to bring people up to a point of resilience so that they are going to be aging better? Do you see an improvement in aging clocks? And do you see more resilience to infection with the people you're working with?
Oh, absolutely. We're seeing, tremendous changes, and we're treating people, seeing the Herx reactions, and getting them beyond that. So it's all about, Dr. Carter, my team always says, how full is your bucket? And we're lowering the bucket. And I was just telling someone today, actually it was Mike, that to do a study on the biological clock with, say, iron, ferritin, all those, and iron in the soft tissue, that's an 80-year study. Who can do that, Carol? And Dr. Klatz, you can't do those studies. So you have to go inferentially. So what we've done, since every one of our biomarkers is titrated to early mortality, every biomarker has the exact same endpoint. And then every biomarker in the literature has well-published hazard ratios. So in other words, homocysteine has more effect on, say, longevity than, say, C-reactive protein or uric acid. And those are published, and I've compiled them statistically into an average so that they're somewhat accurate. So what we do is we give people a mortality score based on a composite of at least 20 biomarkers. And you increase precision and accuracy as you add more biomarkers, because they're all titrated to mortality. So what we do is we give people an overarching score. And the beautiful thing about that is, in 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months, do they lower that score or not? And then we can tell whether our interventions are working properly, or if they're working properly, or if our program is designed properly to help them get to that point. And then we break it down into 6 categories: inflammation, immune response, metabolic, oxidative stress, infectious burden, tissue destruction. So we look at all those, and clotting. So we look at all those, and we give you a score for each one. So then we can piece it down. Dr. Klatz, this is what when you said the 70,000 plus ICD-10 codes. So we're breaking it down into 6 categories, which relate to our mechanisms of disease. So we can say, okay, we need to focus on oxidative stress. We need to focus on immune health. We need to focus on infectious burden. We need to focus on, your metabolic status. We need to focus on something that's, breaking down protein, creatine kinase, lactate dehydrogenase, things like that. Even I can't stand the lipids, because LDL and HDL are just soaps. They're soaps that carry fats through your body. LDL carries soap. LDL is a soap that carries fats to tissue. Why do you need fats for tissue? Every cell membrane is phospholipid fat bilayer, so you need them to rebuild. But HDL is actually a marker of tissue repair, because if your HDL is low, it means you are using essentially all the fat. So LDL and HDL function in a recycling cycle. LDL carries fats out to tissue. HDL carries excess fats back from tissue to the liver to be either reprocessed or discarded. So if your HDL is low and your LDL is high, you have a lot of repair going on. But creatine kinase is a great marker for that. So that's what we do. We try to keep it simple. Did my overall score improve? How bad is my overall score on a continuum? Health isn't either, you're either healthy or you're sick. It's a continuum. So we placed you accurately on that longevity continuum. Did you move in the right direction? And then when we break it down into the subset of the 6 categories, we can focus very more effectively on those mechanisms. And then we tell you where you are for each biomarker. And so what we've developed is a rough AI, artificial intelligence, to link between the biomarkers. We digitize our risk scoring system and protocols and supplements. Like Optimal DX, you run their labs, they're pretty good, and they just spit out supplements. We're not doing that. We're spitting out an educational program as to why that marker is up. But more importantly, Dr. Klatz, I know you reasonably well. I know a little bit about your story. Carol, I know less. Okay, so like Carol, you're a single biomarker. That's all I know about you, a single biomarker. Dr. Klatz, I have a few biomarkers, but my children, like, I know a lot about them. And so what I'm trying to say here is a lab and an explanation of a lab is not a single thing. Each lab tells a story. C-reactive protein has a different half-life than red blood cell distribution than fibrinogen. Each one of those markers are telling me something about inflammation in the vessels. But the fact that they have different half-lives present sort of it helps me create a more cogent story about what's going on in the underlying physiology and just saying, oh, your fibrinogen is elevated and your C-reactive protein is elevated. If your RDDW is elevated too, it tells me that this has been going on for at least 4 months. It's probably chronic. And then the magnitude of them make a difference as well. So my take-home lesson is labs are not, standard of care is wrong. The ranges are much narrower for mortality and even narrower than that for optimal longevity. And a single lab is a very poor indicator of what's going on in your health, both acutely and particularly chronically. And we need to weave a story from these labs and then create programs to get you better based on that story.
What does it cost to go through your program?
So it's less than $1,000 for most indications. So for example, I'm a cancer docuseries right now, and that's a $1,500 program. But what you get for that is you get our digitized risk assessment. It takes a half hour. It's very telling. I can show you data on how our risk assessment actually predicts labs and vice versa. Then we have a 1-hour consult to explain it and build an initial program around that. Then there's between 3 and 10 hours of coaching, depending on the indication we're going after. Like if you just want to optimize your health, it's 3 hours of coaching over a 4-month period. Then one of our practitioners, myself, Dr. Carter, will come in about halfway through and do a half-hour checkup and see how you're doing and see if there's any questions that the coaches aren't answering. We might do a spot check lab at that point. It's all included. And then towards the end of the program, say 2 weeks before the end of the program, we run the labs all over again, the full set of labs. And then we have a final exit consult with a practitioner and a coach to see, have we achieved our goals or there are more things to do. So my basic optimize your health program is $720. So once again, 2.5 hours of practitioner consulting, 3 hours of coach consulting, 57 biomarker panel at the beginning, 57 biomarker panel at the end, and complementary spot checks based on any marker that was elevated at the beginning that we want to just do to see how we're progressing, to do a little spot check. So we're not just
Your average client, from a biomarker point of view, how much improvement do you see? Forget the average. Your ideal patients, your ideal clients who follow the protocols, to come in with something that's measurable, how much improvement are you seeing?
Well, I'm going to give you a worst case scenario. I'll give you a corporation where the people get my program for free because the company's paying for it. And they have less skin in the game because of that. And even the supplements are provided for free. So the last group we tested was a little bit over 100 people. And 5 of them got slightly worse. Maybe 15 stayed about the same. But that leaves 80% that saw some improvement in their overall score. And we've had some people improve by 50%. We have a 0 to 7, so 0 to we had a 0 to 7. Now we're changing to a 0 to 10 scale and just amping it up. But you know, achieving my number for perfect blood is essentially impossible. I've never seen, including myself, I've never seen it perfect. So like, you're always at the best people are 10% away from perfection. And most people are in the 25 to 50% when you interpret labs appropriately. So
many people were in the study, and how long has have
that was a 100-person study, and that was a 6-month. That was a 6-month.
6 months?
Yeah, that's
interesting.
Pretty significant.
You know, I find, Ron, that everything is log linear. So like, I have a couple case studies. It's hard to show things externally, but with disease like psoriasis or rheumatoid arthritis, I had 2 cases in that group. One, his hand was a claw. Okay, the joints were so swollen. He was a machinist and on disability, and we completely his fingers were double. They were so, and nothing was happening month 1. Nothing happened month 2. Nothing happened month 3. He was reporting a little change in pain. His pain was pretty severe, 8 on a scale of 10. And then month 4, a little bit more, and then month 5, and then month 6, it exploded. So that's the challenge in chronic disease. It's like we're wired for instantaneous gratification, but it takes.
When it exploded, you're saying that he got complete function return?
Complete function. We had a lady with psoriasis on her hands so badly she couldn't wash her hands for a year without being in pain. Cleveland Clinic, 3 types of dermatologists, infrared light, the whole thing. We healed her from inside, nothing external, and we saw the exact same curve. Matter of fact, I was riding back. I live in outside of Knoxville, Tennessee now. I used to be a Bostonian. The heck with that. But I was riding back from Nashville, seeing my biological dentist friend Tom Lockensgard to Knoxville, and Sandy texted me, and she showed me a picture of her hands that she took, and they were all blistered and cracked, and now there was just some redness, and it was like, I was shocked by that. And that was at about the 5-month mark, but you could still see little like hazy areas, white patches, things like that. But in month 6, it was completely gone. So that's the challenge we have, Ron, is getting people to stick with something. They can go out 3 months and see nothing, and they say, well, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. But see, in chronic disease, I have a very simple philosophy. If it took you 20 years in, it's going to take you 2 years out on average. It's just, we're not snapping our fingers, and you've got to be patient. And that's why I try to make it really, scientifically sound, so people really understand and they get buy-in on it and they believe. And I set up expectations at the beginning of the program that if you want instantaneous gratification, go see your doctor, get a drug. And you might get some instantaneous gratification, but instantaneous gratification and health are 2 very different things.
How long have you been at anti-aging?
I've been at anti-aging for 18 years.
And in those 18 years, what are the 3 most dramatic interventions you've come across that you think have great potential for extending both the quality and quantity of the human lifespan?
So I'm going to start
with the exception of diet and exercise. That's a given.
Well, I'll give you one that goes way back that I consider an intervention, even though it's very doable from a nutritional perspective. But that is, and it extends way back to the Viking era. And this is a medicinal that reduced the death rate from tuberculosis in the 1800s so bad that people were coughing blood in hospital. It reduced It reduced death rates by 50%. And that is high dose cod liver oil. Okay. Dose cod liver oil. Vitamin A and vitamin D together are the strongest anti-infective that you can take that's natural, in my humble opinion. The second thing is, and even the American Medical Association is morphing this way with a shocking paper that was published in JAMA Oncology in April by some Harvard folks, recognizing that the microbiome is finding a role and will continue to find a role in cancer treatment. And when the American Medical Association, which is in pharmaceuticals bag and protecting doctors, is saying that and they're publishing this, that this is now, they realize that this is coming, and if they avoid this and they marginalize this, they're going to look stupid. So the microbiome, but I will say, Ron, my approach to the microbiome is quite different than most. Probiotic companies advertise CFU, colony forming units. That's irrelevant. It's the diversity of the organisms. You want to create a milieu so that one will form a colony and then they should replicate. But what I do is I do a four probiotic rotation program with everybody, because no one has a perfect gut continuum. And they just take one of different types of probiotics on a revolving basis on a 7-day program. And, we evolved 400,000 years ago, according to Harvard, cooking and fermented food. We've only had electricity, 3-4 generations? Before that, salt, gorging, fermented, harvesting, ice. So our little stomach compared to the 4 large stomachs of a cow, and this is very important for longevity, is designed around that adaptation over creation and eons, okay? So cooking, I tell women, they think I'm nuts until I explain it. Don't eat so many salads, do stir fries, because you don't have the 4 stomachs of a cow to extract nutrients from a blade of grass. So cooking and fermented food, and the fermented does not have to be live culture. If it's been fermented, even if it's been pasteurized, it still has broken down the food, which accommodates our small digestive tract, and our small digestive tract has been able to accommodate a large brain, micronutrients, high metabolic activity. So getting that microbiome and then supporting digestion with more cooked foods. And if you think all the nutrients went into the liquid, drink the liquid like I do. Mm-hmm. Nothing leaves my stir fry pan and goes to the trash. I drink the liquid. If that's where all the nutrients are. Don't worry about that. Cook low heat and fermented foods. And then the third thing is emerging technologies, going back to Rife, going back to Dr. Tremp, who was treating eye diseases as systemic diseases, but going back to Ehrlich. So this goes back a little further, but I think it's an important point. Something anti-infective. I mean, Claude Bernard, internal terrain. We need our internal terrain. But a lot of people I see have fixed their internal terrain and they're still not well. That's because this infectious stuff took over. You fix the terrain, but it's still able to, infections can change your genome. That's how clever they are. So we have to combat them. And personally, cod liver oil, hyperbaric oxygen, frequency therapy, ozone, methylene blue, chlorine dioxide. I do risk-benefit analysis, so I'll use things like minocycline for the brain because of its anti-inflammatory effects. I'll use it at a antibiotic level to downregulate inflammation. So if we put it in buckets, it's get your omega levels up. And if you're going to do that, you might as well do it with something that has higher levels than fish oil of the fat-soluble nutrients. get the microbiome as diverse as you possibly can, and support absorption of micronutrients by cooking and eating more fermented foods, and then treat infection, particularly with some of these emerging technologies. Right now, I'm on a methylene blue therapy. I won't go into why, but I have a little pathogen hanging out, as a lot of us do.
And what have you discovered with regard to treatment for spike protein? Because that seems to be a major issue with regard to long COVID.
Right. So Dr. Carter on my team, if anybody wants to go really deep on that, he's the guy to work with. Me, I'm a little more superficial, but first we run all the labs and fix your foundation. So like if infection popped up over here, root canal there, poor absorption, just the things I talk about, we fix those first. But, I've solved long haul by recommending ivermectin at a dose that Dr. Corey talks about. See, when you're done with COVID and you took ivermectin, you're done symptomatically, but the spike protein is still there and still potentially active below the covers. It's still there. So keep treating. And a lot of people have overcome their energy issues by adding hydroxychloroquine. They work together, kind of like vitamin D and vitamin A. The intermittent fasting, sweat, try to exercise even if you don't feel that great. You need to shed. You can do some carbon detoxification, Christopher Shea's product, GI Detox. Those are important. The nicotine seems to have an effect. Aricept for Alzheimer's is just a nicotine. It's a poor version of nicotine, which allows acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter, to not be removed. So it can be an excitotoxin, but in COVID brain fog, that's not a bad thing. So there's some very interesting things on nicotine out there. So in nicotine gum, you don't have to do enough to get addicted, but it has helped me with improving my sense of smell that disappeared when I had COVID back in December. So those are the main things. But see, it's more about the long COVID isn't just about the spike protein. It's the things that were allowed to come out and play because of it. So if we're just focusing on spike, then we may be missing. I'm using Nigella sativa, black seed oil. The World Council for Health, Tess Laurie and her group has an excellent treatise on spike protein detoxification that looks at the various mechanisms of the spike protein. So I highly recommend people go to the World Council for Health.org website and look at that. But the main thing I recommend, what Dr. Carter says, and it's self-serving, but this is what we think we're doing the right thing. Get labs and find out what's up. And now we're not guessing, we're testing, and we can focus on these things and the mechanisms that drove them up, that the spike protein caused to happen. So it's a cascade effect. Yeah, it's a spike protein, but it's some downstream effects that have to be looked at too, not just the spike. Well, I had a lady yesterday that was scared, and I said, the first thing you're going to do, my dear, is one of my mechanisms is fight or flight. You're putting yourself in fight or flight. Relax. Testing. Take a deep breath. Don't be happy. And that's really important for health. And then figure out what's going wrong in your physiology and treat it. Her monocytes were elevated. It's a beautiful thing. Your body is detoxifying from the spike with these macrophages. And let's fix everything else.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lewis. It's a lot of good information. It's kind of it's 10 pounds of useful information in a 5-pound bag for sure. I want to applaud you for the work that you've done, And for people who want to find out more about your optimized laboratory testing and protocols, how can they contact you?
Yeah, the best thing is, and it's a little bit of a long website, but hopefully it's memorable. Health. We want to revive your health. So Health Revival Partners with an S, because you do the work. So at healthrevivalpartners.com. And we run weekly webinars, Dr. Klatz and Carol, and they're free for anybody who wants to attend. They're Monday at noon and Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern. We get really good speakers, but we also go into things like the ferritin iron ratio and, how to properly shed blood. A lot of people said they can't shed blood. Dr. Carter can write a script. You can get rid of, you can't donate blood. We can get rid of that blood for you. Things like that. There's always a way around the system if you want to live a long, healthy life.
Well, that's for sure.
The
system doesn't seem to be focused on that topic. You really have to work around it.
Money and longevity are incongruent, it appears.
Dr. Lewis, have you archived your meetings that you have on Mondays and Tuesdays?
We do. What we usually do is, if they get banished, we put them on Rumble or BitChute. We put them on YouTube. And then if someone came to my website, healthrevivalpartners.com, and signed up for the blog, all our webinars are announced through the blog. And then when the content is published, we announce that the content is now available, if you missed it, to watch it later on any one of those different channels.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And for the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine, for Immortality Now, I'm Dr. Ron Klatz, wishing you a long, healthy, happy life. God bless, and realize that we're in a fight for our lives. Make no mistake about it. The pathogens that are upon us, unfortunately, are not natural. They have come from other sources, and we have to fight. And we have to fight. We have to fight together if we're going to win the prize of longevity, which, as my speaker today is placing at 120. I myself am hoping for 150, but 120 is okay. God bless you all.